Here we're going to take a look at chi-square analysis and some of the examples of what we would use it for. Now, square is a non-parametric analysis, which means that we don't necessarily have to have a normal distribution in order to be able to use the analysis system. We're going to see also that we don't necessarily have to have an n greater than 30. So although this places some limitations on what we can do with a chi-square, it is very useful for situations where you may not have the parameters necessary for conducting a t-test or a z-test or other analyses that are parametrics. So here, we're using a chi-square. We use these to test the accuracy of a particular model or some other expectations that we have of an outcome. It's often called a goodness of fit test. So what we do is we test the hypothesis that an observed frequency distribution conforms to or fits some claimed distribution. So we're having a projection. Here's what we're expecting to see. Here's a pattern we're expecting. And then we test that and go, do we see that pattern or do we not? So we use this for testing regression equations. We don't really get into that in this class. Regression equations are pretty intense, and so we've left those out for this particular semester. But in more advanced classes, you'd be taking data and conducting a regression equation that allows you to predict future outcomes. And then I would go through and do a chi-square to see how well does that fit. We also use this to look at in comparison to numerically derived patterns, so looking at patterns of last digits or first digits. And also again, lastly, for testing associations between a row variable and column variables. We don't really look at that one, but that's an important component for higher level testing as well when we're trying to compare our data. So, examples of when we use this. Checking accuracy of data collection. One of the biggest problems when you're collecting data that doesn't really get addressed in this class is having people not report the data exactly the way you need them to. So, for example, if I am looking at biomedical models, I want to have a weight that is actually measured, not simply the person reporting. Measured weight is much more accurate. Same thing for height, blood pressure, a lot of the different variables we look at in biomedicals. So making sure that your data is accurately collected is actually critical for proceeding further forward. If you're working in research labs, it's one of the first things we do once we have data sets is we run checks on them to make sure the data is actually indicating that it has been collected in the proper way. We actually do the same thing for scale surveys. In psychology, we can run tests to find out whether or not the pattern of responses indicates that the person was in fact simply bubbling in the dots, not actually reading the questions and answering them honestly. So this is a really serious problem in data collection, and chi-squares is one of the ways that we can check that before we proceed to conduct analysis with the data. We use it for assessing any type of patterns that we're interested in looking in. So in a moment, we're going to look at an example for usage of services. So this is very common with organizations. They want to know what services are getting used, what is the pattern, how have those changed or not. And also, for example, looking at staff or resource needs. We use them for detecting fraud, so we're going to look at an example for how we can use that to detect fraud. And as we said before, comparing a calculated regression line with observed data. So chi-squares are really useful and let us do a lot of really important work, especially, again, when you're working on the real world and you don't necessarily have all the ideal parameters. So let's take a look at an example here. We're going to be looking at an analysis I used to do for the sexual assault crisis center that was down in Athens, Georgia. Here we've got the logo from the Fort Wayne, simply because you guys need to know that you have a sexual assault treatment center, and they work with forensic nurses, which is just really amazing. That's an awesome resource to have in the community. It's a shame you need to have them, but we do need them. So, looking back at when I was doing analysis for the sexual assault center, for any organization, you're going to have filing evidence for progress and outcomes for any kind of funding opportunities. So I was helping them conduct the analyses they used for maintaining or acquiring funding to provide services for a 5-county area. Some of the services that were provided through this center were individual counseling, both for adults and unfortunately also for children that have been sexually assaulted. A 24-hour crisis hotline, which is where I also worked as a crisis intervention, a support group for individuals. We also did outreach and education to help people understand what sexual assault is, in terms of being able to both prevent it and also reaching out and getting assistance when necessary, and counseling for family and friends of individuals who've been sexually assaulted. So when we were looking at going through this, we would assume and randomness, and then we'd be looking, for example, for any previous patterns of use. So when you're looking at comparing a pattern, you can either assume a randomness across all of the conditions, all of these different services, or you also could apply previous patterns of use. Most of the stuff I did was using previous patterns of use, and we were looking at, for example, if you're getting funding, say to improve your outreach and education program, you need to be able to document that your pattern of whatever usage, outcomes, whatever it is that you're choosing to assess has changed and increased due to this funding services. So that would be an example of where I'd use a chi-square to go, here's our previous patterns, and then I'm going to look and see, has this new pattern changed, right? And that would be used as evidence that the funds are being used appropriately and we're improving our services. So one important caution, however, when we're talking about looking at this and looking at frequency patterns, do be aware one of the mistakes that people can make when you're used to working with data is to assume that larger numbers are always better and that's the most important thing, or patterns of usage alone are sufficient. This is not the case. So to give you an example from when I was working with this data, the use of counseling for family and friends was a very sparsely used set of resources. However, it was used when the survivor was refusing all other services. So we were not able to be in touch with the person in any other way and support and help them. But by reaching out and then doing counseling for their family and friends, we were able to provide a network around that individual. So that particular resource met a unique need of a small population that would otherwise be missed. So that is another pattern when you're looking at is, are particular services meeting the needs of a small, unique population? Now, this is really important. When we were looking at these different services, we paid attention to how long the individuals were remaining in contact with the center, along with also assessing certain basic outcomes in life, wellness patterns. So it's very common for somebody who's been sexually assaulted to perhaps be unable to go into work. This can cause them to lose their job. That can spiral into losing their housing. Now they're homeless, or they're trying to find a place to stay with somebody that may or may not be the best options. Substance abuse is also really common after a sexual assault, as the person tries to block out and just numb out their feelings in terms of what has occurred. So it's really important. One of the things we did at the Sexual Assault Center, the sexual assault has occurred and we're going to try to help the person work through it, but we also want to make sure that they're not spiraling into a pattern of losing home, losing their job, and actually having themselves in more dangerous situations where a sexual assault is more likely to occur a second time. So keeping in touch with the individuals allowed us to assess where they were and, if necessary, intervene quickly before things became too extreme. So one of the things we counted for our success rate was how long individuals using these different services were staying in touch with the center. And we counted it as pretty much a success if they were staying in touch 6 months to a year. After that time period, usually the individual, if they're getting assistance, has moved through the most dangerous components of it and usually start to do pretty well on their own. So this would be an example when you're saying, what would I be assessing as a success or non-success? It would be the length of time that the individual is staying in contact with the center. And we counted them staying in contact for 6 months to a year as a success. So this is just a little bit to tell you about chi-squares and how we use them in terms of, for example, assessing services that were being used for an organization. In the example for the Sexual Assault Center, some of the services did not, in fact, have N sizes that were meeting the requirements for using parametrics, or they had non-normal distribution. So I could not use a t-test, but I could do chi-squares to still be able to file reports.